Hey family, Reverend Russ, back again with another ministry pivot. I am super excited. This is episode number 23. If you're just joining us, haven't seen some of the other episodes, I encourage you to go back and check out some of the first ones that we did while we were in the midst of this global pandemic, and some of my friends that were on. And so there are some really good ones there, but super excited about this ministry pivot. We did one recently with my friend and sister, Dr. Brianna Parker. Make sure that you check out that when we talked about data. Also on the website, don't forget to comment, to like, to subscribe, to share. That's the way this podcast gets heard by more people. Just quickly sharing it with somebody. Just quickly, if you're on Apple Podcasts, quickly liking it, writing a little comment. That's also how this podcast is able to be seen by more people. Super excited about the hundreds of people every month who come on to Ministry Pivot to get some insights, to understand some stuff, and even ask some questions. But super excited about the last episode again with Dr. Parker. Looking forward to you all being a part of the 5-minute pivot series. And so those have been going forward and people have been commenting on those. And so you can see all of that on ministrypivot.com. And then, of course, don't forget there are articles there. Recently wrote an article that was shared a couple weeks ago that you can find on ministrypivot.com asking, where have we grown? Several places throughout the pandemic, we've seen that they've gotten better because the pandemic has forced them to get better. But the question came then, where has the church gotten better? Where have we gotten better as leaders? And so there's an article there that I would encourage you to look at, and super excited about all the other articles that are there. Shout out again to my partners there at Givelify. They're doing great work there with you and your church. And so I'm working with them. And so super excited about that partnership. But coming up next, super excited about today's episode. But before I talk about today's episode, we also have coming up next my friend and brother, Pastor Gerard Gunner. He's going to be talking about Riot Starter, a new book that he has on youth ministry and how to equip young people to form, get this, a righteous riot. So super excited about that. You can pre-order your copies there. I'll put a link inside the show notes for you to check out Riot Starter as well. But that's going to be coming up in a couple weeks. And then super thankful for Bishop Walter Scott Thomas. We were able to sit down and talk about he and his church. Super shout out to New Psalmist Baptist Church. They've been in person now for several months. And so he was able to share some hindsight, some thoughts, some reflections on what it looks like going into in person, and some pivots that he made. And I won't steal the thunder, but that conversation is super great. And you definitely want to hear it. So that's coming up soon. So please make sure, again, that you comment, you like, you subscribe. That's the way that you'll be able to get notified about these pivots as they come. But today, for episode number 23, I am super excited to have my friend and my brother. He really is my friend. Y'all gonna see when we start talking. Pastor Reverend Dr. Heber Brown III. He is a friend and a brother beloved. Super excited about our past and our history. You'll hear some of that in this episode. But Pastor Heber is the pastor of Pleasant Hope Baptist Church in Baltimore, Maryland. He's doing a great job there, but he's also the founder of the Black Church Food Security Network, a super organization that is doing great work in the community, not just in Baltimore, but all up and down the East Coast. And I'm pretty sure he's going to expand it beyond that with really simple concept that is helping churches to use the space that they don't use often, but to use that space as green space so that we can get rid of, or that we can lessen these food deserts. We actually talk about that a lot inside this episode. Super excited about Pastor Heber being with us on today. Again, super excited about you being with us on today. Don't forget to like, to comment, to share, to subscribe, to get notifications so that we can move forward. But let us move forward now with my conversation with my brother, Dr. Brown. Pastor Heber, man, so honored and super excited for you to be with us today on Ministry Pivot. Super excited to have you here, man. Thanks for saying yes and making some time to be with us on Ministry Pivot.
Anything for Reverend Russell St. Bernard. Glad to be here, man.
Man, it is super good to have you. Those that don't know, who are watching, listening, whenever you're watching, listening, Pastor Heber and I are really friends. We're once a year friends, though.
Once a year.
Oh man, there's so much that goes on outside of the camera. But Pastor Heber has been
my once a year friend for several decades now. And I am just super excited to have him on Ministry Pivot. I do want to give him a chance to share a little bit about, but I want to start this Ministry Pivot with the question to Pastor Heber about, man, your calling. We met at Morgan State University decades ago, and we were on campus. I was doing stuff that was not like what Pastor Heber was doing, and I was throwing parties, and I was trying to get him to come, and he would not come to my parties. But I thank God for him. And then later on in college, I'm asking him to say it how he remembers it. But later on in my college life, I finally hear the Lord. And then I'm a part of this thing that Pastor Heber started called Young Clergy for Social Change. And that was one of the pivotal moments in my ministry life. We were really trying to engage society, engage culture, engage the church. And it was really a great moment. But I'm going to stop, and I want Pastor Heber to say the way he hears it, the way he knows it. But Doc, the way I want you to answer the question is, how did you understand your call in ministry? And I think that Morgan piece plays a part, not me, but just the Morgan part.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, you know what? You make me think about a number of things. One of them is a book that I was blessed to read some years ago called God's Yes Was Louder Than My No. It was a part of like our ministry training program at the church of my upbringing, Shiloh Baptist Church in Edgemere, where my father still pastors to this day, Bishop Heber Brown II. And in that book, they wrote about one of the types of calls that the author wrote about was a non-cataclysmic call, right? It's like no lightning, no thunder, no bells and whistles, but a grooming and a shaping and a molding over time that points in the direction of ministry. And that's what I feel like I had coming up, watching my father in ministry, watching my grandfather, Bishop Heber Brown I in ministry, and so many uncles and aunts also. It's a family full of folks who are in church leadership in some way, shape, or form. And it just felt natural. It felt right. It felt good to think about myself in that way. And then so when I get to Morgan State University, you know, those thoughts were kind of already in mind. I was pushing back a little bit saying, no, I'm going to be a therapist. I'm going to be a counselor, which is why I pursued a degree in psychology. And so I was pushing back against ministry a little bit. And then I pushed even harder when I met you, and you were like the cool, like you were the coolest guy on campus. And I was like,
yeah,
man,
no.
like this guy, he had like the New York fitted down over his head, and his clothes are always fresh. And then another buddy of ours, Harold, was always kind of rocking out with him. I said, man, maybe I should leave this church stuff and go be like Russ. And
I'm so glad you did not. I'm so glad. I'm so glad. Because I'm here with you now. I'm so glad.
But yeah, man, and so it was gradual, and you know, even with the slight kind of wondering whether or not there was something else out there for me, by the time I graduated, it was like, nah, this is it. I went to seminary at Virginia Union, continued in my theological training and growth. Some years later, went to the D-Min program at Wesley Theological in DC, and started pastoring in 2008. In fact, I preached my first sermon November 2000. And so it's been some years, and you're so right. Shortly after preaching my initial sermon and becoming licensed in the Baptist church to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ, I grew increasingly dissatisfied with just coming to church, come to a building on Sunday morning, sit for a couple of hours and leave. And that was the extent of my religious and spiritual obligation to a great degree. I felt like there was something more we could do, especially as it pertains to the African-American community and the generations of traumas and assaults that we've experienced in this country. And I didn't quite know what I could do, but I knew I had to do something more than just, you know, sit in the pulpit area and just be satisfied and comfortable being in the building religious leader. And so that's when Young Clergy for Social Change eventually bubbled up, and it was like, all right, listen, let me reach out to some of my peers, who are also in ministry, who I like, who I hang out with, and see if we can figure out what to do together and how we can, make a difference based on our understanding at that time. And yes, I thank you so much for agreeing and saying yes to that invitation to join Young Clergy for Social Change. I still have vivid memories of us hanging out and doing different things, having different events, and even attending events. I'll never forget one event you came with me to, and I still remember your face like, man, why in the world are we here? But thank you so much for that. And I'm so proud of the fact that for many of those folks who were a part of Young Clergy for Social Change, I'm still connected to, still know, and still celebrate the great things God is doing in all of your lives. But yeah, man, it was really fun to experiment with a different approach to ministry together at that pivotal moment in my journey and in our journeys.
Yeah, no, it was great, and I'll just say before we pivot to the next piece of this is Young Clergy for Social Change was super helpful for me as I was trying to find an understanding of how church and God made sense to this dude from Brooklyn, wasn't really brought up in church. You know what I mean? I went, but it wasn't like a thing.
Right.
And it gave me a different space, and it challenged me because one of the meetings that Heber's talking about, I'm pretty confident we're not talking about the same meeting. One of the meetings, though, I will say we met, God bless, Dr. Kane Hope Felder. And I had no idea that in a couple years I'd be going to divinity school and I'd be in his class. And then not just that, I would be an assistant to him in some of his other grad classes before, he transitioned like that. That stays in my head, and it was super dope. But one of the things that I want to say, one of the challenging moments, I remember us going to a march on the White House, and I don't remember what it was about. I can't remember what it was about. I have no context. I remember that I had a sign, and Heber said, "Let's go," and I'm like, "All right, cool." They gave me a sign. I didn't make the sign myself. Somebody had made the sign already. They gave me the sign, and Heber said, "Yo, we might get arrested." And I said to myself, "Brother, I made it out of," listen, Heber, I don't know if I told you this before, and everybody who's hearing it knows it now. I said, "Yo, I made it out of Brooklyn, out of the projects. I ain't never been arrested. I'm about to get arrested for some church stuff." I was like, "Yo, there's no way that's supposed to happen." The Lord was kind, and other people got arrested, and I did not get arrested that day. But I wasn't ready. But I say that story, and I say it in a funny way now. And Heber didn't know, that's why he's still laughing. But it developed something in me to trust God in stuff that I wasn't equipped for, nor was I thinking about. But because of you and your push and your commitment, I just believed it, and it still makes sense to this day. It still makes sense with the church not being in. I mean, a year like last year, we all know that the church could not be in the four walls, and so ministries like the ministry that you are a part of, and actually the way I want to pivot now is to talk about I want to get the name right, the Black Church Food Security Network. I want to talk about the why of it, and I want to talk about what it is. And I know specifically the why of it, again, being from Brooklyn and living in Baltimore for a while, I'm very clear on food deserts. But can you talk a little bit about that, and then we'll kind of hone into it a little bit as well.
Sure. I just want to say super quick. So I did end up getting arrested that night. The cuffs that the officers used to restrain me, I still have as a nice trophy here on my shelf.
Oh man! So that night you did get, man. The Lord.
I got arrested that night. I got arrested,
wow, brother.
And we were protesting the war in Iraq. And so Bush was president at the time. We were protesting the war in Iraq and got arrested. I was terrified, but I just want to speak this thing because I think it's important, and I love the way that you help to chronicle the histories of the various people that you interviewed. It was people like Reverend Marion Bascom, who was a pastor in this city, passed some years ago now, but he was a part of something called the Goon Squad, who was a group of preachers and lawyers and politicians who in Baltimore City were known for challenging injustice in various ways. So Reverend
Wow.
Marion Bascom, people like Pastor William Calhoun, people like Bishop Doug Miles and others. I was a young 20-something preacher looking at them and following their lead. But when Reverend Marion Bascom stepped forward and said, I'll get arrested, and he's 80-something years old when this was going on, I was like, who am I at 20-something not to step forward with this elder? And so I just raised that to say, to especially to older and established pastors, that people are looking at our example. And thankfully, I had a Reverend Marion Bascom to say, listen, we don't just have to applaud what Dr. King did. We also can lean into what our Christian witness can look like out in the world today as well. And sometimes that involves risks, and my risk is not your risk, but there's a risk, there's a sacrifice that all of us have to make. But that flows right into the Black Church Food Security Network in this way. It came out of a recognition that our health as a community was connected to our lack of agency and control over our food environment. You can't get a handle on your health if you don't have control over your plate. And so many of our communities, whether you're talking about Brooklyn or Baltimore, you have Black communities that do not control their own food environment, do not control the food situations in their neighborhoods. And in fact, it's led so many to say now, instead of food desert, we call it food apartheid, because it was an intentional segregating and redlining that created these neighborhoods the way they were. So sometimes food desert obscures the real culprit into how things came to be. But when you say apartheid, it's heavier. It's a heavier phrase. And it points to the intentionality of this. And so when you think about it that way, our community is sick on purpose. Our community is sick by design. And so as a pastor, when I started pastoring, man, I started going to visit with members of our church who were in the hospital for diet-related illnesses. And I did the thing that we were taught in seminary to do. You know, we pray, we share scripture, don't stay too long, give encouragement, and leave, right? I started doing that so much, I started saying, now, wait a minute. Now, I'll keep on praying and giving scripture, but there's got to be some way to stop this merry-go-round of the same members of my church going in and out of the hospital. And so I began to swim upstream and say, well, if we cannot gain access to the nutrient-rich food that we need, and if we know that it's not sustainable to forever be dependent on charity, what can we do to create our own infrastructure to feed ourselves? Many people, including Thomas Sankara, the former president of Burkina Faso in West Africa, and so many others have said, whoever feeds you controls you. And we are oppressed as a community in part because we do not control our food sources. And so in this past year, so many churches have been involved in food distributions, and we're so grateful for churches like Kingdom Fellowship, AME, like Pleasant Hope Baptist, and so many other, Little River UCC, so many other congregations in the Mid-Atlantic who are engaged in food distribution. But the churches I just listed and others connect with our organization so that we get our nutrient-rich produce from Black farmers. And
that's great. That's great.
That's the way we approach it.
Now explain the pipeline of the Black farmers, because we Kingdom Fellowship, shout out Pastor Watley and Reverend Kendra, who's leading our food outreach stuff. But explain. I want you to explain the pipeline. But I also want to make this note. I had City Council President Nick Mosby on a couple months back. And he mentioned a book that I read and I devoured, and it was wild. Not in My Neighborhood, which literally speaks to. So if you're listening and watching and you didn't listen to it when Councilman Nick, with another moment to talk about it again, because Dr. Heber is absolutely correct. Our communities have been shaped to look the way they look. And growing up in Brooklyn, I didn't understand that, why I had bodegas and other people had supermarkets, but it was shaped that way. And the Not in My Neighborhood talks specifically around Baltimore, but it can be applied to any urban situation. But I wanted to pause and just make that note. I'm gonna ask about resources later, but I wanted to make that note there. But can you talk about the pipe? Because that was one of the things that was super exciting for us at Kingdom, was to know that we weren't just buying produce from you, but we were getting produce from you that was developed on farms that African Americans held.
That's right. That's right. So a couple things come to mind. One, it's important for us to know that the largest landowner in Black America is the collective Black church.
Yeah.
The constellation of Black churches in this country, we own more land than the NAACP, the Urban League, the Congressional Black Caucus, all of that. And in this country, if you own land, remember now, we talk about 40 acres and a mule. Remember now what formerly enslaved Africans wanted when they came out of slavery. They wanted land. Black churches have land. All too often, however, that land is sitting fallow, and that land is sitting underutilized in the full scope of this ministry possibility. Our organization comes alongside the Black Church Food Security Network. We come alongside churches and help you to start gardens or expand agricultural projects on land you already own. And if you do that, we've seen gardens and agricultural projects attract resources and partners to ministries to help you do more ministry, even in other areas that don't involve the land. So it can be the land can be a powerful partner in your ministry if you embrace it as such. So that's one thing that we do. The other thing is we hold and organize, this is pre-COVID, of course, but we were organizing miniature farmers markets inside churches so that after worship on Sunday, all the food is there, goods are there, and we can support our own as opposed to driving down to some national corporate chain and our money being siphoned off away from our community. What Reverend Russ what you just referenced is the pivot that we did in COVID. Our pivot was the Black church supported agriculture program, where we connect Black farmers and Black churches in relationship, not just transactions. And our organization we stand in the gap around transportation, food storage, and distribution. So we'll go down south and go get the food. We go to North Carolina, we go to Virginia. We'll go and get the produce from the farmers. We'll drive it back. I personally have driven the truck down to pick up produce and bring it back to Baltimore or wherever. But we take care of the logistics and administrative side of connecting the dots. We got Black farmers who have been struggling for a generation with land loss and lack of resources and opportunity. You got Black churches, oftentimes in Black communities, with members who are struggling with health-related and diet-related challenges and a lack of agency over our food system. So what we do is connect the dots. We network weave. We leverage our existing assets, and we feed ourselves while supporting Black farmers along the way too.
Yeah, and it's phenomenal, the amount of food. I remember being at the church, because I'm a fan of staying in your own lane, so I wasn't supposed to be there for a pickup, but I ended up being there. And here is Dr. Heber Brown III lifting the back gate, and it's like just tons of sweet potatoes, and I'm looking and I'm like, man, this is just phenomenal, and it's phenomenal because it's stuff that's good. It's stuff that's going to be healthy and nutritious for us that we wouldn't normally have access to, not just readily access to, and it's different than what you'll find inside a supermarket. So I want to double back though on one thing, because I'm the church operations guy, and somebody who's listening, I think they hear this, but I want them to hear it in a different way, because what he just said was that pre-COVID, and we're actually going to get back to this because COVID is lifting, right? We pray for those who lost their lives. We pray for those who are impacted. But the world is opening up, so church will start happening again. So there's nothing against you having those farmers markets again that will be after church. But what I want the pastor or the leader to hear is it's for the community. So if you're struggling and thinking about a way to allow people to know who you are, there's no better way than if you go on. So first of all, on Sunday morning, I know that we're in church because we love the Lord. But there's a large majority of our community that's not in church. If you just not go to church on Sunday and look what's happening, stuff is happening. And farmers markets are one of the things that are happening. And so if your church, on your church parking lot, or the part of your parking lot that you don't really use anyway, got with Dr. Brown, and he helped you think through a way to make that feasible, to plant something, to grow something, and then you did a farmer's market after. You can be appealing to your community in a way that you haven't appealed to them before. And then who knows, maybe they will join, maybe they will come and see what service is about. But I think that's a key avenue to expose the church to the community in a different way. Does that make sense, Doctor? Have you all seen some of that when you've been doing it?
Absolutely. I mean, I think you framed it up, set it up perfectly. That's exactly what happens. It's taking the existing resources of the church. That parking lot you just referenced, Reverend Russ, you wasn't using that part of the parking lot, no way. Or the church kitchen, which I know is one of the holiest places in the building. Everybody can't go up in there. But I believe that God didn't give that kitchen to be utilized one day out of the week, and it's not utilized for the rest of the week. Or your church bus that's sitting there right now. Like, we have the basic ingredients in the Black church to not just address charity in terms of food, but justice as well. And what you just said as well, Reverend Russ, is so on point, because it's also an it could be an evangelistic piece as well, to connect with your neighborhood in a meaningful way. And I promise you that sweet potatoes and collard greens will go much deeper than your track or your holy water when it comes to the people who not come to church. No, people who not coming to hear your sermon, no way, are not going to be impressed that you're doing this, that, and the third inside your building. But that nutrient-rich produce that you're providing can go a long way. And even if they never join your church, I believe that God will still be pleased and their lives will still be enhanced, because we determined to be the hands and feet of God in our neighborhoods.
I think that's awesome. But before we pivot to shift, I want to ask for how does a church who's listening, a leader who's listening, how do they get involved with the network? How do they get involved? How do they even assess if they're saying, well, that's cool, but it doesn't really work where I am, or he hasn't seen my space. How do they get involved to see if it's feasible? Which I'm sure most times than not, it is feasible. But how do they get involved?
Yeah, I would say one, find us on social media, Black Church Food Security Network. And you'll see we host a number of webinars and panel discussions where we share much more about this information. And we give examples as well in terms of what other churches are doing. That's one way. If you already have, if you have interest, if you're watching and you have interest, we ask that you get 3 to 5 members of your congregation with your pastors and leadership support to reach out to us. You can email us at info@blackchurchfoodsecurity.net. Send us a note, and we'd love to set up a time to meet with you and hear more about what God is already doing. We just want to be wind to the sails of what God is already doing in your church. Me and our team in ministry, we're not coming to build a brand new sail. You already got stuff going either on the health front, or you got stuff going on the outreach stuff, and maybe this can enhance what you're already doing. And so we want to help you think through that, connect you with resources and other partners to help you to do that, introduce you to the Black farmers in your neighborhood that you can come into relationship with, and really just dream together. I mean, we're not trying to be kind of present like a Happy Meal, like here's the box, take your Happy Meal, go do this, because we recognize that every neighborhood has, and every church has, some unique characteristics that have to be taken into account when you're trying to even think about food ministry in this kind of way. Final thing I'll say on that point, though, Reverend Russ, is I want to encourage people who are watching who might be interested to know that this also is not a surface or a shallow, like this is not something you can just plug and play and leave and forget. Because when you're talking about establishing relationships with Black farmers, that takes time. That takes listening. When you're talking about connecting with the food justice community that's already around your church, that takes time. So it's as we said earlier, I've been driving the bus to pick up produce. I've been lifting boxes of sweet potatoes, or going to other churches and supporting their discipleship efforts through this food ministry. So I would just say, be ready and be very thoughtful and discerning about whether or not this is something you want to connect with, because it can be transformative, but we can't have a transactional kind of attitude, like a consumerist, like consumer attitude. I put my money down, I want my product. Like that Whole Foods mentality is not going to work, because we are building a Black-led food system, and we're co-creating Black-led food systems anchored by Black churches. And we're going to have to be meticulous and careful. I know you love numbers, but we have to watch the numbers as well, and the people's relationships too.
Yeah, no, and I think that's great. And in quick terms, he's saying it's going to be work, and you can't back out, because if you back out, you might back out too early and miss it. And I think that's that's super right. I know at Kingdom we've made a commitment. We're continuing. We're actually talking about how do we figure out, because we help those who it's not a food market per se. It's food. It's just helping. It's giving out food for free. And so we're talking now about how Reverend Kendra doing an awesome job. We're talking about how we do wraparound services, right? So how we help so that they one day don't need to come for this food, but we do other things around that. So I think that's awesome.
Move on, Reverend Russell. I think it's important that we point out that with Kingdom Fellowship AME Church, you all have a cold storage unit, and that is the kind of demonstration of commitment to this food justice ministry, because you talk about a place to kind of store nutrient-rich food before it gets distributed to the community. That's huge. And I think there's other things that other churches could do as well along those lines, demonstrate their commitment to this, but also to prepare themselves. Like, for example, buying refrigerated vans. So I guess I'm inviting us to think, to embrace a systems approach to ministry. So when it comes to running a conference, we put on our systems approach hat. I want us to do that same thing when it comes to food ministry. Put on your systems approach hat. Think about the different layers. Think about the different avenues with respect to putting together a food ministry that supports a community-led food system. And then look at your church budget, look at your church calendar and programming and personnel, and say, what do we need to do to lean forward in a systemic way to address food insecurity, food apartheid, and hunger in our neighborhood that goes beyond charity? That's the kind of pivot that I think we have a perfect opportunity to look at right now, being that basically our churches have had to endure a hard reset. And no pastor that I'm talking to right now is wanting to come back after this pandemic, go back into the building and do the same exact thing they were doing before. So I think that this kind of food justice ministry and systems approach is an opportunity for some churches to really give some serious consideration and thought to.
No, I think that makes total sense. And just operationally, right? So that's my role. So I don't touch everything, but when stuff happens operationally, I can tell you specifically. So that cold food storage unit, that's on a part of our parking lot. And it's actually on a part of my parking space. So we were talking about it, and we were like, yo, we need this storage unit. We can't put it in the building because where we are right now, it needs to be close, but it can't be in the building. And the best place is this parking, that staff parking. And it was like, yo, and Rev is kind of be on yours. I said, yo, it don't matter. Like, who cares? Like, this needs to happen. And let me say, I don't know the full details of it, but that unit, while it was expensive, we were able to get grant funding for a large part of that unit, if not all of it. So I don't want pastors to hear it and say, well, I don't have the kingdom. We don't have kingdom money. We are trusting the same God that you're trusting. God has been kind, the same way God has been kind. But there are ways. Don't allow yourself to be blocked out of it because you think you can't. Travel it down the road until you see the number or until you see the opportunity that blocks it and says you can't. Don't allow yourself to think about it that way, because I think that is super helpful. But for us, when I remember us talking about the cold storage unit, we've transitioned our fellowship hall, the beloved fellowship hall that we used to eat in, is now our Kingdom Cares warehouse. Wow. We had a bay door that was there. So when you delivered, Pastor Brown, when you came to the front side, you wouldn't do that now. You would come around to the back. We've put a hole in the building and we have a full bay door. The lift door was already there, but because we were a church, we didn't think we needed it. So we closed it off. And midway through COVID, we broke that door down and the lift worked. And now we got a full, grocery store lift gate in the
That's
back
what
of
I'm
the
talking about.
building so we can do it. And we
That's
just pivoted. And so even when we go back in person, that's going to stay because
right.
we're not going to do fellowship that way anymore. We'll do it differently. We're also working on this new building, so that's a whole other thing. But at the
Right.
point is that we had to make some shifts and we had to look at some stuff and see what could we do differently in order to reach the right goal.
What
Go
you're
ahead.
saying, real quick, if I can, to the pastor who will say, I don't have Kingdom Fellowship money. That's me too. I don't have Kingdom Fellowship money. I think it's important people know. Pleasant Hope Baptist Church, where I'm blessed to pastor, been there 13 years now.
Amen.
We're talking about 150 people. I'm talking about 150 people. I am the only full-time staff person. I wear multiple hats. I know most churches in America are more aligned with my pastor and church
Yep.
experience than a Kingdom Fellowship. But nevertheless, with 150 folk, with an average size church building, we are able to do mega ministry because of the vision and because of faith to believe that if God gives vision, provision is also there. Partnership is also there. And so we maximize our partnerships as well. Y'all, the money is there. The partners are there. And if we take the time to study, connect, pray, get still, analyze what our gifts are, and do our asset-based assessment of our churches, you too can find an on-ramp to a ministry like this.
Amen. That is awesome. That's awesome. So, and that's actually where I'm going to push us to end. I want to do a whole nother pivot with you just on culture and church culture. And I want to use some stuff around it. We're not going to do that today. So y'all, we're going to do that another time, so that he and I can be more than once a year friends. So y'all going to help us do that. But before we leave this pivot, I want to ask you the question I ask everybody around resources. So we're going to have show notes. So all of the books and resources that we talked about are going to be in the show notes. But are there any kind of resources or books that you would recommend? Like we talked about Not in My Neighborhood. I'm going to mention actually High on the Hog, a Netflix series that came out that talks about food and its journey from Africa over. And he does a really phenomenal job in that series. But any resources that you recommend those who are watching or listening would pick up that would help around our conversation and just really in general?
Yeah, I think a great book to read to get some history around Black farming and community development is a book called Freedom Farmers by Dr. Monica White. It's a great book, maybe about 200 pages, so not super thick, but it really will baptize you into the history and histories around how Black communities have attempted to use food to strengthen themselves and to organize their power. So I would say that. I would also say to our family of the faith that there are examples in people's ministries that I think we should study as well. And so if I could just lift names like Pastor Leon Sullivan out of Philadelphia. Go study his ministry. He did something similar in terms of going beyond the walls for community outreach. I would lift up Reverend Vernon Johns out of Virginia. He was the OG to Martin Luther King Jr., Wyatt T. Walker, and others who also saw ministry and farming together. I would lift him up too. Reverend Albert Clegg Jr. from the Shrine of the Black Madonna. He also did something similar. So I raise these pastors' names and preachers' names because sometimes as ministers and pastors, we need to see other models beyond the eloquent oratorical skills of people like Dr. King. Love, respect Dr. King, but just being a mouthpiece and just being, not just being, but the models of King have really limited his genius to just being somebody who had a dream. And I think pastors can be helped by seeing other models of ministry, but you have to go and search for them because they're not the models that are popular today, but they really are the ones that are helping to point the way for me and how I show up in ministry.
That's great. That's great, man. Dr. Brown, I appreciate you being on Ministry Pivot. Appreciate you being a part of this episode, but more so appreciate your ministry and how you're listening and your faithfulness to God and all that you're doing with the network, and excited about the churches and pastors and leaders that will connect from this, and even those that will just connect in general. Looking forward to you coming back. Really want to talk about culture. So because that's one of the things that I had on my list, but we can't do all of that at one time. People will tap out. So we're going to do that next.
Sure.
But again, thank you all for getting on to Ministry Pivot. Don't forget that this is your season of opportunity. Don't forget to share, to comment, to like. The show notes are in the bio. So please make sure you download those, you share those with your friends and family. Thank you again for getting on. Looking forward to seeing you next time. God bless.